So, hello everyone. My name is Silvana Freire. I am a fourth-year doctoral candidate in the Psychology and Social Intervention program in Applied Psychology. And today I will be sharing with you a conceptual paper that I wrote as part of my comprehensive exams last year, which I titled Bringing Social Connection and Social Capital to Two-Generation Models, the Case of Parent-Child Groups. Thank you all for being here today. I'll start the presentation with the motivation behind this paper, followed by a brief background on parent-child groups, and then I'll walk you through the conceptual model that I'm proposing on the paper, and we'll end with practical implications for this model. So as many of you may know, parenting in the early years can be both deeply fulfilling and incredibly challenging. Caregivers often experience high levels of stress and isolation at higher rates than non-parents. And these stressors can have profound impacts on both caregiver well-being and children's development. For instance, a survey conducted in 2021 showed that over 65% of parents reported feeling lonely compared to 55% of non-parents. And also a 2023 APA survey found that 1 in 3 parents reported high levels of stress in the last month, again at higher levels than non-parents. And as you can imagine, for low-income, immigrant, and displaced families, challenges are even greater due to other economic and sociocultural stressors and limited access to support networks. So I believe that to address some of these challenges, we need interventions that build social connections and supportive communities for caregivers. And these type of environments not only support the emotional well-being of caregivers and build their social capital, but can also enhance child development. So I'll present a bit of the gaps that I identified in the literature that motivated this paper. So in the last decades, there has been a growing support for two-generation approaches that intentionally address the needs of both children and their caregivers in an integrated way. However, despite this push, few two-generation programs prioritize caregivers' mental health and psychosocial well-being as central outcomes, or include strategies that explicitly build and strengthen their social capital. Additionally, around the world, group-based models are widely used in parenting programs, and this type of delivery modes are often preferred by caregivers and are also more cost-effective than individual approaches. However, evidence on the effectiveness of these types of models is still limited. So in this context, I believe that parent-child groups offer a promising whole family model that should be further explored. So the purpose of my paper is to develop a conceptual model that brings together a dual developmental science framework and social capital theory to explain how group-based parent-child interventions can enhance outcomes for both children and their caregivers. So the dual developmental science framework takes a whole family perspective by recognizing that development unfolds in dynamic and bidirectional ways that influence parents and children together. So rather than centering one generation, it emphasizes both. And then to complement this framework, I also draw on social capital theory. And while social capital has been defined in many ways across the social sciences, it generally refers to the tangible and intangible resources that are embedded in social networks and the resources that people then can access and mobilize to support their own and others' well-being. So together, these frameworks help me conceptualize a model that centers caregiver psychosocial well-being, that positions social capital formation as a core component, and that can also articulate what are the mechanisms that can link group-based interventions to better outcomes for both caregivers and children. Finally, in the paper, I also explore potential mechanisms that can extend to the community level and what it means for scale-up and sustainability. So before presenting the conceptual model, let me briefly talk about what parent-child groups are. So these are structured programs where caregiver and children come together for the purpose of sharing activities that can support children's learning and development, strengthen parent-child relationships, enhance caregivers' knowledge and skills, and also build these peer support networks among caregivers. So as I was mentioning before, group-based models have been widely used in different parenting interventions as an alternative to the traditional dyadic type of interventions, such as home visiting programs. And also when considering group models, we can think of groups that are parent-only or child-only. But in this case, parent-child groups uniquely leverage the dynamic interactions across all participants, including caregivers to caregivers. So one prominent example of parent-child groups are playgroups. And these are programs that are very common in Australia and in some parts of Europe, and provide an alternative early learning context for children in their preschool years. Playgroups bring together multiple children and caregivers, as I was explaining before, for play-based activities that not only support children's development, but can also foster connections and mutual support among caregivers. Another feature that it's interesting about playgroups, and it's very common in one of the types of playgroups implemented in Australia called supported playgroups, is that these type of programs aim to support families facing social or cultural barriers, so they can help them build both their parenting skills, but also strengthen their community ties. And the evidence on playgroups so far suggests that these programs are promising for both generations, with studies that have documented benefits for children's language, cognitive and social-emotional development, as well as improvements in caregivers' parenting, well-being, and social support. However, here's where I find the challenge, because experimental and quasi-experimental evidence on this group or these programs still remains limited. And most of the evidence that we have, for example, about playgroups, come from qualitative or observational studies, and mostly conducted in Australia, which can limit how broadly we generalize the findings to other places. More broadly, if we think about parent-child groups in general, we have few rigorous studies that measure caregiver outcomes or that examine how these programs foster social capital. And because many parenting programs combine group sessions with other components, it's also difficult to tease apart what's actually driving these effects. So then the field is left with this puzzle, where we see potential, but still don't yet understand the unique value or mechanisms about group-based approaches. So this is precisely the gap that my conceptual model aims to address by making more explicit some of these mechanisms and trying to highlight what are those added values of group-based modalities. So let me start by walking you through a simplified theory of change that reflects how parenting programs are generally conceptualized. So typically, parenting programs offer caregivers workshops or training to strengthen different parenting skills like responsive and stimulating caregiving. They also try to strengthen their self-efficacy and knowledge about early childhood development. And then, in turn, it's expected that these would improve caregiver-child interactions, leading then to better child development outcomes. So as you can see in this simplified example, the child outcomes are the central and ultimate goal, and any improvements in caregivers' behavior or different caregiver outcomes are mainly seen as pathways to get there, to this main goal of child development. But what happens if we bring the dual developmental science framework? So this is what I try to do in the model that I propose. And I outline how group-based two-generation programs can support development and well-being for both children and their caregivers. So first, focusing on children, we can think that they benefit directly from their participation in this type of programs through two potential pathways. The first one is by being engaged in these different stimulating and enriching activities, which is signaled in the A pathway at the top, but also as they interact with their peers and create these social interactions that could also benefit directly different outcomes for children. And that's on the pathway on the bottom. But we can also think that children may reap some benefits indirectly through the different pathways that also enhance caregiver outcomes. Very similar to the common parenting theory of change that I was presenting before. But as I said, the purpose of this model is to also highlight and emphasize caregiver outcomes and explicitly incorporate outcomes that encompass both parenting but also well-being measures. So that's in the central part of the model. But I think what this model also adds is the social connections piece, and thinking how group-based formats can create space for caregivers to build relationships with one another. And these connections can strengthen then their psychosocial well-being, considering both mental health and reductions in isolation, and it can help build social capital that in turn enhances and deepens their connections with their children and the positive investments that they can make with their children as well. So how do these relationships work in practice? So social connections provide opportunities for receiving and also providing support to other peers for engagement and resource sharing among caregivers. So to try to conceptualize the different mechanisms that could be at play, I use Bergman and colleagues' conceptual model that identify 4 key psychosocial pathways through which social connections shape health outcomes. So now I'll explain a little bit of these psychosocial mechanisms that I think can operate within group-based parent-child programs. So the first one is social support, which refers to emotional, informational, and practical help that caregivers can get from their peers as they participate in these groups. So for example, caregivers can connect with others that are facing similar challenges, share experiences, offer parenting tips or community knowledge, and even help with concrete needs, like giving each other a ride or watching each other kids or navigating specific services. A second mechanism that could also operate within these programs is the access to resources and material goods. So beyond support, these groups can also increase access to services and tangible resources that might include formal referrals or even informal exchanges, like, for example, sharing toys or clothes from their children, helping each other apply for benefits, or passing along opportunities like job opportunities. Then the third mechanism that these programs can also emphasize is the social engagement that gets created by the opportunities to foster friendships and a sense of belonging within these groups. So caregivers might, you can think of caregivers participating in these groups and creating these friendships, and then maybe organizing play dates outside of the program or attending events together, or even taking roles in their own communities. And also something that has been documented in playgroups in Australia is that caregivers sometimes would also take on different roles within the programs themselves. And these forms of participation can help caregivers feel more connected, valued, and seen, not only in their roles as parents, but generally as individuals. And then the last mechanism that I want to mention is social influence. And this highlights how being part of a group shapes behavior through shared norms, social comparison, and modeling. So sometimes some of these can be subtle, like maybe a caregiver noticing how another parent handles a challenge, and then through social comparison, learning about these new strategies. Or other times it could be more direct, like reminders and encouragement from peers to stick to a specific goal or routine. So altogether, these mechanisms help explain how group-based programs support not only parenting practices, but also caregivers' broader psychosocial well-being. Okay, so now finally to wrap up, I want to also touch on what this kind of theoretical work means for practice and what implications it can have. So first, when I was developing this model, my hope was that it can help us rethink group-based parenting interventions, not just as a mode of delivery that is more cost-effective, but as a meaningful space where families can build relationships, strengthen support networks, and access broader forms of social capital. Then I also think that in this model, by specifying how change happens and what mechanisms really matter, we can design programs that are more intentional and aligned to families' needs. And hopefully this framework, by doing that, can also guide funders and practitioners in evaluating what's working and also refining theories of change behind existing programs. Ultimately, I believe that it is especially critical and important to consider frameworks like this and programs like this in under-resourced communities where social connections can make the greatest impact. And community-based models that nurture these relationships can become powerful tools for promoting both child and caregiver well-being. So thank you all for your attention, and I love to hear your thoughts. Happy to open the floor for questions or feedback.
Any questions?
I have one. Thanks, Silvana. I know that you went to Australia this summer and had a chance to observe some of these. So I was just curious if you could share a little bit about things you saw or like learned while you were there and part of these play groups and any evidence that you thought kind of like confirmed some of these different pathways that you've hypothesized in your conceptual model.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that question, Emily. I did have the opportunity to go to Australia this summer and was invited by one of the main lead researchers of playgroups in Australia to a conference, but also to go and see how one of these playgroup sessions unfold. And as I was mentioning before, in Australia, it's very common to have two prominent models. One is called facilitated playgroups, which looks more like one of these programmatic, not very structured, but more structured interventions. And then there's another model that is called community playgroups, which are more volunteer-based, volunteer-led. And I think even the supported playgroups, one of the aims is to then like become and like transition to becoming one of these community playgroups. So when I went to one of these sessions, it was really reassuring to see and like to hear from the participants a lot of these mechanisms that I was hypothesizing. For example, one that I always thought that the piece of social support and like accessing help and resources may be something that is pretty common. Even research that has been done here in the United States, in New York, has seen some of these mechanisms of like access to resource playing out in relationships that caregivers generate and foster through their interactions with daycare centers. But then the social engagement piece was also very important, especially this piece of like how in the community playgroups, the volunteer-led, how the volunteers would fulfill different roles within these programs. And they would tap into either their own professions, like for example, one of the caregivers, she was trained as an early childhood educator. So she was in charge of creating different activities and sort of like leading more on the curriculum if you want, although there wasn't like a specific curriculum, but like the different activities. There was another caregiver that happened to be in maternity leave, but she was a lawyer, so she was doing more of like the paperwork. Another one that was taking the lead role on the budgeting and finance. So they were telling me that like even fulfilling those roles kept them engaged in their sort of like whole self beyond just being a parent. So that was also really interesting because I wasn't sure if that part was like too much of a stretch on the theoretical model, but hearing the experiences of these caregivers kind of like validated a little bit of those pathways.
Thank you.
I have I think it's more general, not about your model specifically, but I'm wondering if throughout reading and everything, like why Australia seems to be so gung-ho on these group-based parenting. Like why are they, you know, the first to seemingly do this? Is it a government initiative? Like,
Yeah, I don't know exactly like the whole history, but I know that now there are some that are like government initiatives, and there are other NGOs like Play Matters Australia, for example, in the Brisbane area. Like they support a lot of these playgroups, even both types of models that support it, but also the community playgroups. So that's something that like I would also like to know, like what were the mechanisms to like make this such a big movement in Australia. But I think also the relationship with like indigenous communities also led to a lot of like these creations of supportive communities and like how to make the integration more supportive, I guess, like for everyone. But I think beyond Australia, there are some examples, maybe not with the same name. I don't think they are called playgroups necessarily, but there are some examples in different places in Europe. Like, for instance, in Portugal, a few years ago, there was, I want to say, like the first or kind of like one of the only randomized controlled trials evaluations of a playgroup type kind of intervention that was, I think, implemented in like 5 different cities in Portugal. But I think that one was called playgroups. But then I know there are other experiences in France and Italy and the UK with different names. So the person that I met in Australia, she's actually working to like make a more cohesive framework that can pull together from the experience that it's so dispersed right now. And I think it's also like one of the limitations of why this has not gained more like traction elsewhere, because it's not like standardized, or like we don't know the literature or like the evidence from like all places. So I think that probably is a future direction for this work, and to try to like bring this kind of initiatives to other places as well.